What if one ordinary-looking Australian 50-cent coin in your collection is the one everyone else overlooked? Before you spend another coin, stop and look closely. Some dates are getting serious attention from collectors, and the details can change everything. Stay with me, because today we're uncovering 3 Australian 50-cent coins that could make you see your old change completely differently. Coin number 1. There is a dangerous mistake people make with old coins. They see darkness, dirt, and an aged surface, and they immediately assume the coin is worthless. But what if that dark appearance is exactly what makes you stop and look closer? Put a 1979 Australian 50-cent coin in front of you and don't rush past it. This is where the story begins. The first thing you need to understand is that 1979 sits inside an important period of modern Australian coinage. Australia was moving through major economic and social changes during the late 1970s, while inflation and rising costs were putting pressure on everyday Australians. And that matters because coins were not museum pieces back then. They were working money, handled, dropped, exchanged, carried in pockets, and spent constantly. Decades later, every surviving example carries evidence of that journey. Now look at the coin itself. The obverse features the portrait of Queen Elizabeth II, designed by Arnold Machine, facing right with the inscriptions identifying the monarch. Turn it over and you see one of Australia's most recognizable coin designs, the Australian coat of arms, with the kangaroo and emu supporting the shield, surrounded by the denomination and date. It's a design that millions of Australians have seen, but very few people ever learned to inspect closely. And here is where your attention needs to change. This is not a silver coin. The standard 1979 Australian 50-cent piece is a copper-nickel coin, not a precious metal issue. Its familiar 12-sided shape was deliberately introduced to make the denomination easier to distinguish from round coins. The coin weighs about 15.55 grams and measures roughly 31.5 millimeters across, with a thickness of around 2.5 millimeters. Its 12-sided edge gives it a completely different physical feel from ordinary round denominations. But those specifications are only the beginning. Hold one in your fingers. Feel the weight. Look at the edge. Then bring the surface under strong angled light. That is where collectors start looking for the details that ordinary people miss. Your coin has been described as having a black patina, and that dark appearance can immediately attract attention. But this is important. Dark coloration by itself does not automatically make a 1979 50-cent coin rare or worth a fortune. Natural original toning can be desirable, while environmental damage, corrosion, staining, or artificial treatment can have the opposite effect. That distinction can change everything. A genuine aged surface may tell part of the coin's story. Artificially darkening it, polishing it, scratching it, or aggressively removing the surface can destroy the very characteristics collectors want to examine. So if your 1979 50-cent coin has an unusual black or dark patina, never clean the coin just because you think it looks dirty. Never. A shiny coin is not automatically a valuable coin. In fact, cleaning can permanently damage the original surface and leave microscopic hairlines that experienced collectors can see immediately. Original toning matters, especially when the surface appears naturally aged and undisturbed. Now move your attention to the tiny details. Check the date first, 1979, then inspect the portrait, lettering, rim, edge, and reverse design. Look for unusual damage versus genuine minting characteristics. Examine whether the details are sharp or heavily worn. Pay attention to the fields around the design and the spaces between lettering. And don't confuse ordinary circulation marks with valuable mint errors. This is where patience becomes more valuable than excitement. The late 1970s were a period of substantial production pressure for circulating Australian coins. Coins had to be struck efficiently and consistently, and dies naturally experienced wear through repeated use. As dies aged, minor changes in detail could appear. But again, not every difference is an error, and not every unusual-looking mark is rare. Collectors know the difference. That is why professional examination matters. If you genuinely believe your coin has an unusual minting characteristic, unusual surface, or exceptional preservation, professional grading is critical. A reputable expert can help separate circulation damage, environmental toning, cleaning, and genuine mint-made characteristics. And then comes the question that makes people lean closer. Why would collectors want an ordinary-looking 1979 50-cent coin? Because collectors aren't simply buying metal. They're buying survival. Think about how many 50-cent coins have passed through Australian hands since 1979. Think about how many were scratched, dropped, cleaned, damaged, lost, melted, or simply forgotten. Every year that passes removes more coins from the pool of genuinely attractive survivors. And that creates a psychological battle among collectors. When a coin is common in average circulated condition, buyers can be selective. But when an example appears with an unusually attractive original surface, strong detail, exceptional preservation, or a legitimately documented variety or error, the conversation changes. One collector waits. Another watches. A third wants the same coin. And suddenly the seller isn't chasing buyers anymore. The buyers are chasing the coin. That is what makes auction rooms so unpredictable. A coin can sit quietly for years with little attention. Then one unusual example appears, and suddenly collectors begin comparing it, researching it, watching the bidding, and asking whether another comparable example will appear. Sometimes the biggest pressure isn't what collectors are buying. It's what they're refusing to sell. When collectors hold desirable examples, instead of releasing them back into the market, available supply becomes tighter. If demand remains strong, competition can intensify. That is the basic reason scarcity and collector demand matter so much. Now, according to the market value figure provided for this video, this 1,979 Australia 50-cent coin is being presented at a current collector market value of $145.05, but don't make the mistake of thinking every 1979 50-cent coin is automatically worth that amount. A coin's actual market price depends heavily on authenticity, condition, documented rarity, variety or error status, provenance, and what qualified buyers are willing to pay. That distinction is everything. Because if you find one in your change, the smartest reaction isn't to celebrate instantly. The smartest reaction is to stop. Check the date. Inspect the surfaces. Study the edge. Look for genuine mint characteristics. And above all, preserve the coin exactly as you found it until you know what you're dealing with. Do not spend this coin if you genuinely believe you found an unusual example. Do not clean it. Do not polish it. Do not scrape the dark surface. Do not put chemicals on it. And don't let excitement push you into selling before you understand what you have. Sometimes patience creates wealth because the person who waits long enough to authenticate the coin is the person who avoids destroying its potential. Most people see a dark, old 50-cent piece and move on. A serious collector sees a question. What happened to this surface? Is the toning original? Is the coin genuinely well preserved? Is there a legitimate minting variety? Is there an error? Has the coin been altered? And can the evidence survive professional examination? Those questions are far more important than simply looking at a price tag online. Because this is where the hidden wealth story becomes real. The coin itself is only the beginning. The evidence behind it is what can make the difference. So if a 1,979 Australian 50-cent coin appears in your collection, don't treat it like ordinary pocket change. Give it a second look. Feel the weight. Study the design. Inspect the date. Protect that original surface. And if something truly unusual stands out, get professional advice before making a move. You may be holding nothing more than a normal circulated coin, or you may have discovered an example worthy of serious collector attention. And that uncertainty is exactly why you should never ignore it. Because this first coin has already shown us how easily an ordinary-looking piece can trigger questions about rarity, preservation, and serious money. But what comes next is even bigger. The next Australian 50-cent coin has a completely different story, and the detail hiding on it could make this first discovery look like the warm-up. Stay close. The next coin is rarer, more shocking, and even more dangerous to ignore. Next up, imagine finding an old 50-cent coin that looks almost too ordinary to care about. You turn it over, notice a scattering of brown dots across the surface, and your first instinct is probably to put it straight back into circulation. That could be the mistake. Because with an Australian 50-cent coin from 1971, the surface tells a story, and sometimes the details people dismiss are exactly the details that deserve a second look. The year 1971 is especially interesting because Australia was going through a major transition. The country had recently moved into decimal currency, and the early 1970s were a period when the new decimal system was becoming a normal part of everyday Australian life. The 50-cent denomination itself had already undergone a major design change only a few years earlier, moving from the original round format to the familiar 12-sided shape because of concerns about confusion with other denominations. So this coin belongs to an important chapter in Australia's modern monetary history. And that makes holding one today feel very different from spending one back then. In 1971, this wasn't a collector's trophy. It was working money. It could have been sitting in a wallet, passing through a shop counter, dropped onto a pavement, carried in a pocket, or mixed with thousands of other coins. Nobody knew that decades later, collectors would be examining tiny surface details under magnification. Now look closely at the design. On the obverse, you'll find the portrait of Queen Elizabeth II facing right, with the inscriptions identifying the monarch. On the reverse, the coin carries the Australian coat of arms, the kangaroo and emu supporting the shield, with the denomination and date integrated into the design. It is unmistakably Australian, and because the design was produced for everyday circulation, millions of people encountered it without ever imagining that individual surviving examples could become objects of serious collector interest. The coin itself is a copper-nickel composition, giving it that familiar hard, bright metallic character when well preserved. The standard 50-cent piece weighs approximately 15.55 grams, measures about 31.5 millimeters across, and is roughly 2.5 millimeters thick. Its 12-sided shape is one of the easiest ways to recognize the denomination by touch alone. But don't let those numbers distract you. The real question is, what happened to this particular coin over the last half-century? Your example is described as having brown dots across its surface. And this is where collectors need to slow down, because a brown mark can mean very different things. It could be natural toning. It could be environmental staining. It could be surface contamination. It could be corrosion or damage. Or, in a completely different situation, it could be associated with a legitimate characteristic that deserves professional examination? The appearance alone cannot answer that question. That's why one of the worst things you could do is grab a cleaning cloth and start rubbing. Never clean the coin. Never polish it. Never use household chemicals. Never scrape the brown areas. And never assume that making an old coin look brighter automatically makes it more valuable. In fact, the opposite can happen. Collectors often care deeply about the original surface. Original toning matters. A naturally aged, untouched surface can tell the story of decades of storage and circulation. Once you aggressively alter that surface, you may permanently change the coin's appearance and leave microscopic scratches that cannot simply be reversed. That is one of the biggest traps for inexperienced collectors. They see darkness and think, "I need to make this shiny." A knowledgeable collector asks, "Is that original?" That single question can change everything. Now take a closer look at the date, 1971. Then examine the lettering. Look around the portrait. Inspect the rim. Study the reverse design. Check the edge. Look for unusual doubling, die characteristics, striking anomalies, or other features, but be careful. Ordinary circulation damage is extremely common, and random scratches or stains are not automatically mint errors. This is where minting history becomes important. Coins were produced under enormous practical pressure. Dies repeatedly struck blank planchets, machinery operated continuously, and production demanded consistency. Over time, dies could develop wear, surfaces could change, and striking conditions could create differences from one example to another. But collectors don't simply chase anything that looks strange. They chase verifiable rarity. That is why tiny details can become obsessive. One collector might spend hours comparing photographs of the lettering. Another might examine the edge under magnification. Someone else might compare the surface against known examples. And when a coin appears to have a characteristic that can be authenticated, the level of interest can rise dramatically. The same thing happens with condition. A 1971 50-cent coin that spent decades being heavily circulated is a very different proposition from an example with exceptional preservation. Every scratch, every contact mark, every worn high point, and every alteration can affect how collectors judge it. And that's why survival matters. Think about the number of coins produced and circulated over the decades. Then imagine how many were lost, damaged, altered, discarded, or simply worn down from constant use. The surviving population is not the same as the original population. And among the survivors, the genuinely attractive examples form an even smaller group. That shrinking supply is one reason collectors pay attention when something special appears. But here's where things get emotionally interesting. Collectors don't always want the coin because they need another 50-cent piece. They want it because they don't want someone else to own it. That is a completely different psychology. A collector who has spent years building an Australian decimal collection may already have ordinary examples of this denomination. What they may not have is an example with a distinctive original surface, exceptional preservation, documented variety, or another feature that separates it from the crowd. And when that kind of coin appears at auction, bidding can become surprisingly aggressive. The first bid is quiet. Then another appears. Someone raises it. Another collector responds. Suddenly, the coin that looked almost forgotten is receiving attention from people who know exactly what they're looking at. That's the real auction shock. Not that every old coin becomes a fortune, but that one genuinely desirable example can create competition because the right buyers may not want to let it go. And when collectors hold rather than sell, supply becomes tighter. If demand continues rising while desirable examples become harder to locate, competition can intensify. That is why patience matters. If you discover a potentially interesting 1971 50-cent coin, don't rush to sell it just because someone offers you a quick amount. First, establish what it actually is. Preserve the surface. Photograph it properly. Compare it with reputable references. And if the coin appears genuinely unusual, seek professional evaluation. Professional grading is critical when the stakes become serious. A qualified grading service or reputable numismatic expert can assess authenticity, condition, surface quality, and potentially important characteristics far more reliably than a casual visual inspection. Now let's address the number that makes this coin impossible to ignore. Based on the current collector market value supplied for this video, this 1,971 Australia 50-cent coin is being presented at $153,500. But listen carefully, that figure should not be interpreted as meaning every 1,971 Australian 50-cent coin is worth $153,500. A normal circulated example is not automatically a six-figure coin. Real market prices depend on the specific coin, its authenticity, condition, variety or error status, surface preservation, provenance, grading, and actual buyer demand. That distinction is absolutely critical. So if you have a 1971 50-cent coin with brown dots, don't immediately think, "I've found a fortune." Think, "I need to investigate this." Check the date. Study both sides. Inspect the edge. Look closely at the brown areas. Ask whether the surface appears naturally toned or environmentally damaged. Look for legitimate mint characteristics rather than random marks. And above all, protect the coin while you're investigating it. Do not spend this coin if you suspect it could be an unusual example. Don't clean it. Don't polish it. Don't scrape it. Don't apply chemicals. And don't let excitement destroy evidence that a professional may need to examine. Because sometimes the biggest mistake isn't failing to find hidden wealth. It's finding it and accidentally destroying it. This is why collectors develop patience. They know that a coin doesn't need to look perfect to be interesting. Sometimes the old surface, the unusual appearance, the history of circulation, and the tiny details underneath the aging are what make an investigation worthwhile. Most people would see brown dots and move on. A serious collector stops, turns the coin under the light, checks the date, studies the design, examines the edge, and asks one dangerous question: what am I looking at? That question can lead nowhere, or it can lead to something extraordinary. Because this 1,971 coin comes from one of the most fascinating early periods of Australia's decimal currency era, and more than 50 years later, every surviving example has a history that cannot be recreated. The coin has survived. The question is whether it's survived in a form collectors actually want. And if your example has an unusual combination of original surface, preservation, and a genuinely verifiable characteristic, that's when the story becomes much more serious. This is hidden wealth hiding in plain sight, but only if the evidence is real. And remember, this is not fiction. The market can surprise you, but authentication comes first. So check your collection. Check the old coin jar. Check the forgotten change in the drawer. And if you find a 1,971 Australian 50-cent coin with an unusual brown-toned surface, don't dismiss it before you know what you're seeing. Because the next coin takes this hunt into an even more dangerous territory. The surface may look ordinary, but the reason collectors become obsessed with the next one is completely different. Next up, here is where this hunt gets uncomfortable. Imagine pulling a 50-cent coin from an old collection and seeing brown spots spreading across its surface. Most people would call it dirty. Some would throw it back into circulation. But a serious collector doesn't make that decision in 2 seconds. They stop, turn the coin under the light, and start asking a much more important question. What exactly happened to this coin? This is the 1996 Australian 50-cent piece, and there is a reason you should never judge an older coin only by its appearance. By 1996, Australia decimal currency system had been operating for 3 decades, but the 50-cent denomination was still carrying forward one of the country's most recognizable circulating designs. This was a period of economic change, technological expansion, and a rapidly modernizing Australia. Yet inside everyday transactions, these coins were still being treated as ordinary pocket change. Nobody spending 1 in 1996 knew that decades later, collectors would be examining its tiny details. And that is what makes this coin so fascinating. Start with the shape. The Australian 50-cent piece is instantly recognizable because it is 12-sided or dodecagonal. The Royal Australian Mint lists the standard circulating 50-cent specification from 1969 onward as copper-nickel with a mass of about 15.55 grams and a diameter of approximately 31.65 millimeters across the flats. The legislation also specifies a maximum thickness of 3.16 millimeters for the denomination. So when you hold a 1996 example, you should feel that substantial weight in your hand. It is not a tiny, lightweight coin. It has a solid presence, and those 12 straight sides make it immediately different from the round coins surrounding it. The composition is also important. This circulating coin is made from approximately 75% copper and 25% nickel. It is non-magnetic, and its edge is plain rather than heavily reeded. The 1996 issue had a circulation mintage of roughly 19.3 million pieces with additional proof production. Now turn it over. On the obverse is the third portrait of Queen Elizabeth II, facing right, with the inscription identifying the monarch and Australia with the date 1996. The portrait was designed by Raphael Makhlouf. On the reverse is the familiar Australian kangaroo, emu and Commonwealth coat of arms, designed by Stuart Devlin. It sounds familiar, and that's exactly the trap. Familiar does not mean worthless. Look closer. Look at the lettering. Look around the portrait. Look at the rim. Look at the high points of the design. Then look at those brown spots. This is where you have to control your excitement, because brown spots can have many causes. Natural toning, environmental exposure, staining, corrosion, contamination, or other surface changes can all produce unusual coloration. A brown spot is not automatically a mint error, and it does not automatically make a coin rare. But the surface still matters. A lot. Because collectors want to know whether what they're seeing is original. If the brown coloration developed naturally over time, it may form part of the coin's original surviving surface. If the coin was chemically treated, polished, scrubbed, or aggressively cleaned, the story is completely different. So listen carefully. Never clean this coin. Don't take a polishing cloth to it. Don't use vinegar. Don't use metal cleaner. Don't scrape the spots. Don't try to make an old coin look brand new. You could permanently destroy the original surface and leave scratches that professional graders can detect immediately. Original toning matters. An aged surface can sometimes be part of the coin's appeal. Artificially changing that surface can reduce collector interest instead of increasing it. And this is where inexperienced collectors often make the biggest mistake. They think value means shine. Experienced collectors know that preservation is much more complicated. A coin can have dark areas and still have an attractive original surface. Another coin can have almost identical-looking spots caused by damaging environmental exposure. Two coins can look similar to the naked eye and receive completely different opinions from experienced professionals. That is why you need evidence, not excitement. Now imagine what this coin went through. Since 1996, it could have traveled through countless transactions. It may have been carried in pockets, stored in drawers, dropped onto hard surfaces, exposed to moisture, mixed with other coins, or forgotten for years. Every contact could leave a mark. Every environment could alter the surface. Every cleaning attempt could remove something original. And every year that passes makes genuinely untouched survivors more interesting to collectors. That doesn't mean the normal 1996 issue suddenly becomes rare simply because it is old. In fact, surviving examples are still known in significant numbers. The published figures show a substantial circulation mintage. So where does the real collector excitement come from? It comes from the individual coin, its preservation, its surface, its authenticity, its possible variety or error characteristics, and the tiny details that separate an ordinary example from something genuinely unusual. That's why collectors become obsessive. They don't just look at the date. They compare. They photograph. They magnify. They measure. They examine the lettering. They study the portrait. They inspect the reverse. They compare die characteristics. And if something doesn't match the ordinary examples, that's when the investigation begins. This detail changes everything. Don't confuse damage with rarity. A random scratch is not automatically valuable. A brown stain is not automatically valuable. A dark patch is not automatically valuable. But a documented mint-made anomaly, an authenticated variety, exceptional preservation, or another legitimate collectible characteristic can completely change the conversation. And that's why professional grading becomes so important. If you believe your 1996 coin has something genuinely unusual, professional grading is critical. You want an experienced specialist to evaluate the coin, rather than relying on a photograph or an online comment from someone who has never handled the piece. Because once serious money enters the conversation, authentication becomes everything. And collectors can become extremely competitive when a coin checks the right boxes. Imagine an auction. The lot appears. One collector already has several 1996 50-cent pieces, but this example has something different. Another collector wants the same feature. A third buyer has been searching for years. The bidding begins quietly. Then another bid arrives. Then another. Suddenly, people aren't thinking about the denomination anymore. They're thinking about ownership. Who gets this particular example? That is the psychology behind serious collecting. Sometimes, collectors aren't looking for 10 ordinary coins. They're looking for one coin they don't already have. And when desirable examples are locked away in private collections, fewer examples remain available for new buyers. Supply shrinks. Demand can rise. And that is when competitive auctions can become unpredictable. Collectors may hold instead of sell because they believe another comparable example won't appear soon. That creates scarcity at the level that actually matters, not simply how many coins were originally made, but how many desirable examples are available to buyers right now. Now, let's address the figure that makes this particular coin impossible to ignore. For this video, the current collector market value provided for the 1996 Australian 50-cent coin is $112,500. But you must understand this distinction. That does not mean Every 1,996 Australian 50-cent coin is worth $112,500. Published guides show ordinary 1,996 examples trading at much lower levels depending on grade and finish, which is exactly why any extraordinary six-figure claim needs to be tied to a specific, verifiable characteristic, not simply the year and denomination. Coins and Australia. So if you're holding a 1,996 coin with brown spots, don't immediately assume you've discovered a $112,500 treasure. Instead, investigate it. That's how smart collectors operate. Check the date. Check both sides. Check the 12-sided edge. Check the weight. Inspect the surface under good lighting. Look for signs of cleaning. Look for genuine mint-made abnormalities. Compare the details with reliable references. And if something truly stands out, preserve the coin and get professional advice. Do not spend this coin until you know what you're looking at if you believe it may be an unusual example. And absolutely do not clean it, because the worst possible outcome would be finding a potentially interesting coin and then destroying the evidence with one careless decision. This is where patience creates wealth. Not panic, not hype, not rushing to the first buyer. Patience. A serious collector understands that the coin doesn't need to reveal its story instantly. Sometimes the story is hidden in a tiny detail that requires magnification, comparison, and professional examination. Most people see brown spots. A collector sees a mystery. Is it natural toning? Is it environmental damage? Was the surface altered? Is there an unusual dye characteristic? Is there an authenticated error? Is the coin simply a normal circulated example? Those questions matter more than the color itself. And remember, this is not fiction. The 1,996 issue is a genuine Australian circulating coin with known specifications and a substantial mintage. Its standard composition, dimensions, and production history are documented. Royal Australian Mint. The extraordinary part is not simply that the coin exists. The extraordinary part would be discovering a specific example with characteristics that collectors can actually verify and value. That is why you should never ignore the old coins sitting in forgotten jars. Never assume an ugly surface means a worthless coin. Never assume a beautiful surface means a rare coin. And never assume a number online tells you what your individual coin is worth. Inspect first. Authenticate second. Value comes after evidence. Because sometimes hidden wealth doesn't look impressive at first. Sometimes it looks like an ordinary 12-sided coin with a few strange brown spots. And if you are lucky enough to find something genuinely unusual, you could be holding a piece that attracts serious collector attention, a silent fortune hiding in plain sight. But this is where our hunt becomes even more dangerous. You've seen a 1,979 coin with an intriguing dark surface. You've seen a 1,971 coin where brown coloration demands a closer investigation. And now you've seen a 1,996 example where the difference between ordinary damage and genuine rarity could completely change the story. But what comes next? The next coin is the one you really don't want to overlook. Because its rarity isn't simply about looking old, it's about the tiny feature collectors can spot. And once they spot it, they may never want to let the coin go. Stay ready. The next discovery could be the most shocking one yet.